Oh, meeting is being recorded. Okay, let me continue and do it this way. So can everybody see my slides so far and well? I do notice that sometimes when I have the participant box open, it blocks some of the slides. Is everything good there?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. I'm going to get started because I know we're all back to back, it seems, with lots of Zoom meetings and everything else. And I'd love to get your thoughts and feedback on this work in progress, this paper right now. So Stephanie is having some internet issues at her house, given the virtual and work obligations of every person. I can understand that. Hopefully mine will support us. So let me just introduce myself. I am Jennifer Poole. I am an associate professor in the School of International Service. I'm an economist by training, and I'm so thrilled to see so many people here, far larger than our normal group of people in the room. So this will be a nice change. And I think now with Zoom, maybe a lot of people are able to come by that wouldn't have been given busy schedules before. So I'll be curious about your thoughts. This work is joint with Rita Almeida. She may be on the line. She is at the World Bank. Rita and I have a couple of other previous papers looking at similar issues, so you'll hear a little bit about that. So this is the third in our line of work together, thinking about issues of labor market institutions and globalization. And Lorenzo, Lorenzo, are you on? I thought I saw your name. I think he's here, maybe not. So Lorenzo is also at Baylor, and you'll see soon why we poked him to come and join us on this project. And it's a nice syncing of some of his previous work with some of my previous work with Rita. So it made sense to collaborate on this going forward. This work is or has been funded by the United Nations University. They're the wider World Institute for Development Economics Research. And they have a new project thinking about transforming informal livelihoods. So how can we think about pulling workers, particularly, of course, in the developing world, from the informal economy into the formal economy? And so you'll see that some of our discussion today targets that in the end. So without further ado, I also want to give one caveat, and that is that this is very much work in progress. I'm used to this being a very small group of just us economists who we can bounce ideas off of as we are moving forward in the research. And so my slides are a bit rough. This is a draft form that we are presenting more widely at the end of October. So given this new COVID world, this was a very nice commitment device for me to really get some slides on the deck and have something to present that I am looking forward to your thoughts and your feedback so that my presentation at the end of the month can go even more smoothly as we move forward. Okay, so let me motivate the discussion that we're going to have and motivate the question that we're thinking about. We know that for many developing economies, beginning in, I'd say, the 80s and 90s, there were substantive market-oriented reforms, trade liberalization, expansion of foreign investment, And that did coincide with a rise in employment outside of the formal economy. So in the more informal economy, and by that, I am guessing many of you are aware, but just to be concrete, this means paying outside of the tax system. So workers are not paying into taxes. The firms that are employing them are not paying into the tax system. But on the other hand, you're also not receiving the benefits that might come from being a formal worker, health and safety benefits, potentially as a woman, maternity benefits, unemployment benefits if you might have been laid off. And in Brazil, this is the context of our study today, about 30% of manufacturing employment, so this is really going to be about the manufacturing economy right now, according to some of Lourenço's previous work, is in the informal economy. Now, of course, if we were talking about a much larger with the services sector, agriculture, the informal share in Brazil would even be much larger, somewhere upwards of 60% maybe. But in the manufacturing sector, informal employment that is outside the general scope of government taxes and benefits is around 30% of employment. Alongside the sort of rapid market-oriented reforms of liberalization, there has been an increase in communication technologies around the world, right? The digitization, computerization that we are all living full force right now has really changed the nature of work. And that is even so much more obvious right now, but this was still the case before the pandemic, right? In the sense that automation has changed the skill sets needed, and this polarization of the labor force as a result of technological change, that is a rise in the very high skilled jobs and a rise in the low skilled jobs, the polarization meaning that those middle skilled occupations were losing out significantly from technological change. That has been documented quite a bit for the developed world by Azumoglu and Otter. And of course, in previous work with Rita, we show similar effects for the formal labor force in the Brazilian context. But the ultimate impact of trade and technology on workers, on the formal and informal economy, is going to depend on how flexible, right, the labor market institutions that are in place that allow businesses to adjust through and from these economic shocks. So in the face of an economic shock, can you adjust your labor force smoothly in order to adjust to the new market efficient, potentially, option? And so sometimes these labor market institutions that are in place, we can think of these as hiring costs, firing costs, additional vacation pay that might be necessary, right? These are there to protect workers, no doubt, but they may also tend to dampen the turnover and the flexibility that firms have to adjust to economic shocks because they essentially raise the cost of employment for firms. And so our goal in this paper is really to combine these three distinct literatures. On the one hand, we have a role of the implications of trade on informality that Lourenço has contributed to in a very, very nice 2014 JIE paper. And then we have the implications of regulations on informality that Rita and her co-author in previous work also have in some very nice work in the 2009 and 2012 Journal of Development Economics. And so our goal is to think about what is the implications of trade on informality in the context of rigid labor market policies, when firms may not be flexible in order to adjust from the trade shock. Of course, we're also interested in exploring the role of technology on informality. By our reading of the literature, This is very nascent. There's maybe one other paper that considers the implications of technology on informality, technological change on informality. Surprisingly enough, though, they would, or the at least theoretical predictions would be that the implications of technology and informality would be very similar to the implications of trade, and that we may be able to pull some workers into the formal economy because of greater access, perhaps to the search for jobs, etc. And I think this is a really nice way of sort of pulling from several literatures and combining them into one single paper. And it's nice because it also speaks to a worldwide public policy debate on the overall trade-off that we face between economic growth, right? Encouraging the expansion of our, in the trade context, maybe comparative advantage industries, and then recognizing that that is going to mean some job insecurity, at least temporarily for some workers, and how can we mitigate those transitions? So economic growth and job security. Yes, is there a question? I'm hearing somebody. No, just an accidental unmuting. Okay. I'm going to preview a little bit, though, and warn you that because this is a very new paper that we're working through, what you will see today is only going to be the trade side of the story. We have not yet brought in the technology work, and this is a moving process. And I'm curious, part of our discussions are that we might need to split this up into 2 or more papers, and that in thinking about the role of trade, the role of technology with institutions on informality is becoming a bit dense. And so perhaps we will have to split the papers and really focus on trade in this set, and then think about more general technological change and informality in a future paper. So there's a lot of literature that I've already referenced, and I'm not going to dive into it too much given our time constraints here, because I do want to open the floor to questions at some point. We focused in this slide just on the work on Brazil, and there's quite a bit of it. I mean, Brazil has a vast data, and the nice part is that the data on labor enforcement of labor regulations that Rita has access to through the Ministry of Labor. This allows us to do something that not many other papers are able to do, and that is to explore the subnational variation, not just in what regulations are there, but how well those regulations are enforced. So I think it is worth spending a bit of time talking about where we see our contribution to that long literature, though. As I already hinted at, though it's not in what we will see today, I do think there is going to be a solid contribution of our future work in thinking through the impacts of technological change on the informal labor force around the world. At least our reading, and I please welcome you to send us emails if you know of other work that may be addressing this empirically. We don't have a good amount, or there's slim to none. I think in my mind, I can think of just one paper that really helps us to think through the role of technology on informality. And so the impact of automation and the impact of digitization and access to wider digital technologies and computer resources, how has that contributed to the expansion of the formal informal labor divide? Another aspect that, again, will come in the future, but I think is also an important contribution to the broad and the very wide literature that does exist on the impact of trade on whatever outcome you want to think about. I mean, that has been studied almost to death by economists, right? What has been the impact of trade liberalization on workers and inequality and wages and poverty and the environment and conflict and everything, is to consider that trade and technology have been moving coincidentally, right? At the same time. And not just that they go together, but they actually tend to reinforce one another, and that trade can serve to bring new technologies to the developing world, and lower costs of technology can help to facilitate more foreign investment and more trade between countries. And so because these two not just move together, but tend to reinforce one another, we really think this is another important avenue to move forward, to think about how these two forces have maybe have an interactive effect on the formal and informal economy. And then there are, to our knowledge, very few, I actually can think of one or two, that have studied the role of international trade, trade liberalization on informality in the presence of labor market regulations. Previous work by Rita and myself, we in the JDE, have investigated this question for the context of Brazil, but only for the formal labor force. And one of the big questions we continued to get time and time again was, well, I mean, we're dealing in a world where de jure regulations, right? Those regulations on the books are not always adhered to. And that's why we see such a large informal economy. And so though that paper, I think, published very well, and we're very pleased with it, one of the things that was constantly haunting us was what was the impact of trade liberalization on the Brazilian economy, labor market outcomes in particular, in the presence of labor market institutions on the informal economy. The two papers that I do know that do this really focus on a more structural model framework, really taking the model seriously to heart and estimating the parameters associated with that structural framework. So we see those to some extent as complements to what we are able to do in our more reduced form empirical strategy, relying on changes in enforcement over time. So before I move into any more details on the data or the estimation, I wanted to settle a little bit of a, this bit of, I'm not going to call it theory. It's no real theory here, but this is a, just having the conceptual framework in our minds. What are our predictions? What would we expect from a liberalization, market-oriented reforms, trade, and to have on informality in the presence of heterogeneous labor market institutions? And you'll see as we move forward that our thinking about the role of trade is going to be, or empirical thinking, I suppose, how we're going to incorporate it into the data given the timing that we're looking at, is going to be through real exchange rate depreciation. So when the currency, and in 1999, Brazil went through a substantive devaluation of the real, and that effectively overnight changes the relative price of Brazilian goods with foreign goods. And that same relative price change is going to end up having a number of consequences, right? So the real exchange rate depreciation now allows Brazilian goods to be cheaper on foreign markets. So that lower relative price of Brazilian goods should expand access to foreign markets for Brazilian producers. If we think that expansion of sales abroad may lead to an expansion of output and by extension employment in the Brazilian economy for those firms. And so because of that, if we see that expansion of output, expansion of employment, we should, by extension, expect a decrease in informality, in the share of informal workers in the economy, increasing the share of formal employment. This effect, I should say, Eric Verhoeven, for the case of Mexico, and even Ana Ravenga before him, really showed the implications of a real exchange rate devaluation are synonymous to tariff changes. The other implication, though, different from a tariff change, though, is that same relative price change, that same real exchange rate depreciation, is now going to make goods, foreign goods imported into Brazil, more expensive. And so we can think about this as a decrease in import competition for Brazilian firms. Lower import competition now means maybe these firms with a bit more protection from abroad can expand output, expand employment. Again, hinting at a potential decrease in the informal-formal share. But that same increase in the relative price of my imported goods actually means it becomes more costly for firms to also import any necessary intermediate inputs. Higher cost intermediate inputs may then also increase the costs for firms, may require some firms to actually get out of importing those intermediate inputs, increasing the cost, or moving towards domestically priced, higher domestically priced intermediate inputs. In that case, we might expect the shift to move in the other direction, potentially increasing informality. So this right now is just the implications we might think of an impact, a trade shock on informality through a single relative price change. In the end, it's an empirical question over which of these effects we expect might dominate. My co-authors and I have some predictions in that, what we know from the theoretical literature on heterogeneous firms is that exporters tend to be the larger, more productive firms. Those firms that face import competition might be the smaller, less productive firms in the global context, in the Brazilian market. And so we actually hypothesize that it's that decreasing informality, the trade shock will decrease informality because the firms that face import competition, that is this second bullet here, are probably the firms that would have been employing the larger share of informal workers to begin with. And so it is among that set of firms, along that margin, that we would expect the largest shift from informal to formal employment. So then how exactly those changes, those trade shocks feed into the informal economy will depend on the extent to which employers are facing labor market regulations and labor market, in this case, particularly the enforcement of those regulations. And again, I won't go into all of the details, but it is still an ambiguous theoretical idea, an empirical question about the role of enforcement on informality. On the one hand, as I've hinted at before, labor market regulations increase the cost of employing formal workers. As such, we might expect a shift away from the formal economy towards more informal employment when firms face stronger labor market enforcement. On the other hand, from a worker's perspective, those are benefits. I might want to enter into the formal economy knowing that I'm going to receive those higher quality benefits from a formal employment job, from a formal job. In the end, based on previous literature that Rita has done with Pedro Carneiro and that Rita and I have done together, we think the literature has largely settled on, at least empirically, that enforcement of labor market regulations tends to act as a sort of sand in the wheels of economic growth. So if we think back to the trade shock, we're predicting that real exchange rate depreciation will tend to decrease informality as firms face weakened import competition and maybe also enhanced export markets abroad. But that decrease in informality, or by extension, shift towards formality, might be weakened or lessened in places that face strong enforcement of labor market regulations. Again, because the cost of firms to employ those workers is stronger, is higher, right? If we think about the idea that high labor market regulations are going to increase the costs. I'm not going to hire someone if I'm worried that I'm going to eventually have to fire them. It limits job creation, limits job turnover. And this is our predictions for here as well. So that similar trade shock that we would expect to expand the formal economy because of weakened import competition may in fact expand the formal economy by less in areas that are strongly enforced. I've talked a lot about labor policy. So let me just ask a quick question. I am assuming that if there are questions, we should go throughout, and maybe I go to 12:30. Should I instead pause at like 12:15 for questions? We didn't really settle on that before. Is Stephanie want to chime in on any of that? Should I just probably try to push through and leave room for questions at the end?
Well, I was thinking people would interrupt, but it doesn't seem people have questions. Perhaps then let's go to 12:15 and let people ask questions.
I will try to do that. Yes.
Super. Okay. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yes. Let me see. I think then in that case, I'm going to give you a brief background and try to get to some of the actual results and estimation. So Brazil changed its constitution in 1988. The Constitution is very, very favorable to workers relative to businesses in terms of employing those workers. Some of the ideas are firing costs were increased. There is a special fund that Brazilian firms have to pay into when they have workers, and this fund for a worker acts as a sort of both Social Security and unemployment insurance if you are dismissed from your job. You must give workers advance notice, and 25%, I mean, that is a quarter of a worker's time during their remaining weeks, are allowed to be allocated to job search. You can imagine the productivity effects for the firm in that sense. And so these regulations, though, and there's many more of them. There's regulations with respect to health and safety, regulations, of course. The main regulation that we're going to be seeing is, does your worker have an employment card? Are you officially, formally registered as a worker? Right? These regulations are nationwide. However, the sheer scope and geographic dimension of Brazil means that the Ministry of Labor just doesn't have the capacity to actually go and enforce and inspect everyone. And so enforcement of these labor market regulations is heterogeneous over time and across the country. There's a significant gap between what is on the books and how these laws are actually implemented. And so we're going to be relying largely on data from the Ministry of Labor on the number of inspections they do. This data is for each city. There are around 5,000 Brazilian cities, and broad sector. So when I say broad sector, I mean the manufacturing sector is one. There are many different service sectors. We're not really going to be considering those until the end, I'll give you. But we should think about these inspections as a Ministry of Labor inspector goes to the city, goes to the firm, checks on whether workers have their employment cards, and of course, at the same time, also considers and looks for other labor market, whether they're abiding by minimum. You can only work consecutive shifts, 6 hours at a time. Several of these they would be checking off, but by and large, the most important is whether the workers are registered. The workers who were there that day, let me see all of their employment cards to be sure. If a firm is found to be have infracted, then they are required to pay a fine on that. We're going to scale our number of inspections at the city level by a size of each city. Of course, if we're thinking about the state of São Paulo or the city of São Paulo compared to some tiny city in the Amazon, of course, the city of Sao Paulo is going to have more inspections simply because the city of Sao Paulo has more firms and more people and more workers. And so scaling our number of inspections by the population, it is an important, it allows us to sort of not only just measure the direct effect of inspections, but also really think about the probability that you will be inspected given where you are. This graph or this map shows you a bit, I should have labeled it a little bit better, but this is the change between 2010 and 2000. So over the 10-year horizon in the inspection rate for each city in Brazil. So of course, darker numbers, darker shades, darker blues saw expansions in the inspection probability, and lighter shades may have even seen decreases in the inspection rate over time. It's a lot easier to see if I zoom in on, this is the state of Sao Paulo. Sao Paulo is sort of here in this middle area here, almost to the water. And you can see that, I mean, what I want you to take away from this map is there is both city variation, meaning some cities see expansions in enforcement, some cities see contractions in enforcement, some cities may even be neutral in terms of their enforcement over time. And because this is a change, there's also time variation. So part of our estimation is going to be exploiting both across the subnational variation, that is the city level variation, alongside the time variation in the extent to which the different firms located in these municipalities face labor market enforcement by the Ministry of Labor. But you might be questioning, okay, well, what leads to this? This is not random, obviously. Even the change in enforcement is more random than the level of enforcement. Of course, the level of enforcement, as I've already hinted at, might be because of bribes. A labor market inspector knows he's going to or she's going to be able to capture some economic rents out of that firm if they go and inspect. So on the one hand, you might think that inspectors are going to places where infractions are higher, where there's more informality. On the other hand, we know that inspections are also more prevalent in areas that are more developed, richer, to have the capacity at the state level to inspect. And so what we did here in this is just try to think a little bit about some correlates of the changes in labor market enforcement. This is going to be an important regressor in our estimation. So we should understand from where these changes in enforcement are coming. So the main dependent variable here then is going to be the city level change in enforcement over our 10-year period. So from 2010 to 2000. And you can see that, by and large, when we then regress the changes in enforcement on as many sort of city level time varying characteristics that we could think of. And these were also pre-time period, right? So thinking about last period, did I see strong economic growth? If I did, then this period, it's helpful in predicting my changes in labor market, right? Inspectors know I'm growing, so they're going to come to me in the future and think about inspecting the growth. So these are as many city level covariates we could get from another of the basically the Brazilian Census Bureau cidades, so city database. And there's few, but interestingly enough, I mean, the most important is when the sort of economically active population, right, the labor force is growing in the pre-period, then in the future we see changes in enforcement. That makes sense entirely. The good thing is that in our estimations ahead, we will be able to not only in a first stage, in a first test, control for all of these city by year covariates so that we're not worried about there being some omitted variable bias in terms of our change in enforcement as that main regressor. But we're also ultimately going to use city by year fixed effects to account for anything that is different across all cities in a year that we may. And this is sort of getting at, I think I see some questions here. Are you monitoring the chat? I just want to, is enforcement?
No, I had a question about enforcement, if it's de jure or de facto.
Yes. Thanks, Walter. No, this is, so enforcement are what I'm calling enforcement is the number of inspections in a city year per population in that city and year, right? So that the changes in enforcement are telling us something about the de jure regulations are on the books. Enforcement is telling us something about the de facto regulations, right? How are they actually being experienced by the firms? And so this slide sort of hints at a little bit, right, of what I've been harping on, I guess, for the last few slides, right? I know enforcement is not random, right? So in terms of our econometric framework, we need to account for, how we're going to think about and show you that this is truly an appropriate specification to give us some information about the role of trade on informality in a context of heterogeneous labor market enforcement. So as I've mentioned, I think for us, the key is that, first of all, we're relying on changes in enforcement. So this idea that you're concerned about bribes or developed areas or just generally speaking, the level of enforcement being different across different municipalities, we don't need to worry about that. However, if you do think that even changes in enforcement are still not entirely exogenous, I'm going to make a couple of arguments. And the first is, look, we're really going to be focused on that interaction, the implication of the trade shock, whether you're in a strictly enforced or weakly enforced area of the country. And so because of that, that differential effect on what you would probably argue is a quasi-exogenous real exchange rate change, this is something along the lines of what the program evaluation literature might do. And so I think we're in good shape. Nevertheless, even if you still don't buy changes in enforcement interacted with the quasi-exogenous real exchange rate shock, then we will ultimately certainly include city-specific trends, as I've already in the regressors from the last equation, from the last estimation. But then we'll also even more richly be able to include the full interactive city year fixed effects. That means, of course, that we aren't going to be able to estimate the effect of enforcement on its own. But given that that's not our interest is on how enforcement mitigates or enhances the trade shocks, then I don't think that should be an issue. So we're able to capture any of that city year differences in changes in enforcement that way. So let me tell you a little bit about the individual level data. This is all coming from the Brazilian census, the decennial census. So we're going to be focused on 2000 as compared to 2010. Anything you can imagine, I don't know, I just filled out the census. So maybe all of us residing here in the US know what kinds of characteristics they're asking us about our employment, what industry we happen to be in, our education, our marital status, lots of other demographic characteristics. So importantly, for the case of the Ministry of Labor data, we're going to be able to match it based on the employer's residence, the individual's residence in terms of the municipality. As I mentioned, we're only going to be focusing on the manufacturing sector. We're doing that because this is a paper also about trade, right? When we see trade liberalization, especially then and less so now, but we're still struggling to figure out how to think about trade and services. In the manufacturing sector, trade is happening there, and exposure to trade is largely happening in the manufacturing sector. We're going to include only employees, right? We're not going to think about people who are employers and not even self-employed workers, at least in the main sample. I will say that though it's not in this presentation, we have run the estimations again to think about self-employed workers as part of the informal economy, and I'll come back to that. Their results are largely the same, at least qualitatively. And so our main indicator is going to be this issue of whether a worker, an individual, has a formal or an informal job. We're going to rely on the same variable that Penny Goldberg and Nina Pauchnik used back in their 2003 paper on the impact of trade on informality in Brazil. And that is, again, do you have your formal work authorization card? Just to point out, I mean, this data by the census, there's no reason for us to believe that workers would lie about that. This is not data that ultimately are going to be able to take the court. Even if your firm is found to have infracted, it's the firm that will pay the fine, not the worker on being informal. So this is, we're not concerned that workers have at least any incentive to lie about their formal status. And we can see that just a quick percentage here is that the share of informal employment fell quite a bit, fell by a quarter over our time horizon. And so the question then becomes, okay, to what extent would that have been driven by something that we saw in the trade world? So just to hint at what we're going to be doing for the trade data, tariffs were flat, right? The big tariff changes in Brazil came in the 80s and early 90s, right? We see no tariff changes at this time period. And that motivated us to think about, well, how could we then explore the relationship between trade liberalization and informality? And then, so what we do is we rely on what Rita and I did in our previous paper, and that is looked at exchange rates, right? 1999, so right before the first wave, so to speak, there was a major devaluation in the Brazilian real with respect to every other currency. But this single real exchange rate devaluation, it masks the heterogeneity that different industries face, right? So some industries trade a lot with Europe. And so the real-euro exchange rate would have been relatively more important, while some industries trade a lot with the United States. And so then in that case, the real-dollar exchange rate would have been relatively more important. And so we follow Linda Goldberg's way to calculate industry level real exchange rate changes. Effectively, this is going to be what we're calling the trade weighted real exchange rate. It looks at the share of imports and the share of exports coming from or going to a given country, and then weights that by the bilateral exchange rate in that case. And so we're actually going to calculate the trade weighted real exchange rate, as well as, which is just half and half, 50% imports, 50% exports. But then we also will do all of the estimations relying solely on the import weighted real exchange rate, purely import side, to try to really decipher and distinguish between those three different possibilities or theoretical predictions from an exchange rate change. And then of course, also the export weighted real exchange rate. This just tells you a little bit about the heterogeneity across industries. So again, not all industries are facing, even though it was a single change, or basically a single exchange rate change, because industries are trading with different countries, it makes some industries, so here a positive number is a depreciation. Most of the industries over the 10-year period, because of the devaluation in 1999, saw appreciations from 2000 to 2010. So this change gives you a lit. We are going to rely on this across industry over time, this change variation in the real exchange rate shock to identify international trade. To identify trade openness or the impact of trade on your particular industry. So our approach from now, I will try to tie up in the next 5 minutes. I realize I'm already late. Is we're going to replicate basically Lorenzo's early work. Lorenzo's early work in 2014 said, let's think about the impact of, in his case, in an earlier time period, in the 90s, it was tariff changes. So he had an import tariff change and an export tariff change to think about the implications of tariff changes, trade liberalization on the informal labor share. In this case, we're going to be considering that real exchange rate depreciation. And so changes in the real exchange rate, how they impact the informal labor market share. Again, that beta 1 is not entirely, there's no solid prediction for what it could be. Our suspicion or our expectation is that a depreciation, so an increase in the real exchange rate, would tend to reduce the informal share. And so let me, oops, can you see this? I can't see this. There's not a lot of strong, and I apologize for the messy tables. This is something I will clean up before a next presentation. What we're looking at here, if you focus first on column 1, the first on column 1, it's a positive coefficient. It's not statistically significant. that is the overall trade-weighted real exchange rate, and a depreciation of that tends to reinforce or increase the informal share, though statistically insignificant. We then try to focus first on the import weighted versus the export weighted, as we had thought about, those three different possible reasons or ways in which a single real exchange rate shock could impact informality. While the coefficient sizes are different, again, everything is still statistically insignificant. So not all of that real informative. Interestingly enough, we could include both import weighted and export weighted real exchange rates together. The correlation between the two is not as high as you might expect, and so there is significant independent variation to be able to estimate. But what we're really getting at then is thinking about the implications of this single real exchange rate shock on informality, depending on the degree to which employers face labor market regulatory enforcement. And so it's this interaction effect here, gamma 1, that we're really interested in. And so I'm gonna, I think, skip through and give you the bits that is most important. So in this first table, we include just the city fixed effects, industry fixed effects. So we're controlling for anything that might be different between Sao Paulo and, tiny little state in Aceh. We're including differences, controlling for differences across different, the paper sector versus the shoe sector versus textiles within manufacturing. We can see that we begin to get some interesting results on the import weighted real exchange rate in terms of the interactive effect on informality. So let me just explain this to you quickly, and then I'll move on and show you how robust it is to what we've done. This is telling me, look, that trade shock, if we focus on the import weighted real exchange rate, it's negative though insignificant. That trade shock as for us is a depreciation of the currency, is predicted to decrease informality. But the positive effect there in column 2, and then again supported in column 4, enforcement interacted with the import weighted real exchange rate, suggests that decrease, that movement away from informality, is mitigated or is lessened, so a relative increase in informality in areas of the country that were strictly enforced, exactly in line with our predictions. And it does seem to be that it's really that import competition, although admittedly we still can't get out the imported intermediate inputs as different from weakened import competition, though the effects here would seem to suggest that it's the import competition that is really the dominant issue. And I'll just point out that in the next table, we now are controlling for that full city year fixed effects. So if you were concerned about changes in enforcement as still not being entirely exogenous, now we've controlled for all of that. The estimated coefficients, particularly on the import weighted real exchange rate interacted with enforcement, still there, a relative positive, meaning a relative increase in informality in areas of the country that are facing import competition. That are facing heightened labor market enforcement. And then finally, in the last, we even control for all. If you're somebody who's even worried potentially that the trade shock is not fully exogenous, what we're interested in is that differential. So we can also control for the full industry by year fixed effects, and we still see the positive interacted coefficient there on the import weighted real exchange rate with enforcement. Again, hinting that though the trade shock with weakened import competition may have allowed firms to expand, reducing informality or increasing formality, we actually see that movement toward formality is weakened or is lessened in areas of the country that face strict enforcement of the labor market. We also, and maybe I'll leave it there and just leave this up. We did a really interesting, we have manufacturing enforcement, but we also have non-manufacturing enforcement, right? Services sector. And our thinking was, I wonder if there's really something about inspectors come to my city, even if they don't inspect me, I'm still shaken by it and I change my ways. Or because there's limited number of inspectors, if an inspector comes to my city and I know he didn't come to me, it allows me to be even worse than I was before, potentially, if you want to think about it, infract more. And in fact, that story seems to hold, right? That if it's a non-manufacturing enforcement, and an inspector going to a service, maybe going to the hospital in the area to making sure that they're abiding by labor market regulations, but not coming to my manufacturing firm, it actually means that I can continue to be more flexible. I know that there's limited resources for the labor market inspectors, and so I can be a little bit more flexible and my adjustment in that case. I'm going to leave it at that. Lorenzo and I have done so many other estimations that tell us about the robustness of the analysis. If we don't just include sem carteira or workers without labor cards, but we also fully think of all self-employed workers. Some of them might be informal. The estimations really continue to hold. We've also looked at not the share of informal versus formal, but the levels of informal and formal employment, to think about the idea that, okay, well, maybe the share of informal is decreasing, but if formal employment is also decreasing, maybe this really isn't better off for the economy. That doesn't seem to be what is happening. And we've also done some analysis across gender lines, and I'm going to leave it there for now. I don't really remember the gender results off the top of my head. So we've got some work to do to bring in all of the other new work that we've done, but I'd like to open it now for questions and maybe not just questions, but feedback and your ideas for how we could improve this for the next round. Thank you. I'd be happy to take my own questions, since I know Stephanie is otherwise.
I would suggest
so either put a hand up or say it again.
I would just suggest people unmute themselves if they have a question. Perhaps that's the easiest way to go.
Sure. Well, maybe this is the trouble when I feel like I rush through things, is nobody has questions because it's not clear what I've done. I hope that's not the case. Maybe it's just so crystal clear that.
Maybe I could ask a couple of questions, Jennifer.
Sure. Thanks, Walter.
Great. Well, I'm just wondering how to think. I'd like to go back to the theorizing, if I may.
Yeah.
Like ultimately, Brazilian companies want to be competitive. And so I'm trying to understand if they can get away with being cost competitive. Let me try to cost competitive by being less formal or more formal. What would they be doing? It sounds to me that you're theorizing that greater trade exposure. You showed some different directions. It would increase formality or decrease depending on whether. But overall, what do you think connects competitiveness? Wouldn't being able to get away with using or bypassing regulations, being more informal, would make firms more competitive?
So I guess I'm not sure I understand entirely what you mean by competitive. So let me offer a couple of ideas. So first, when I think of labor market regulations, the first thing, and I hate this because it's one of these, labor regulations are there for a reason, right? I don't want any of my work in any of the papers that we've done to sort of make the suggestion that we should get rid of labor regulations, right? This is not the ultimate point. I do think that labor regulations should be allowed to be more flexible, right? In fact, one of the things that I believe it was fairly recently, I'm going to forget the exact year, but 2018 or so, one of the policies that was put forth in the Brazilian government was that we try to be more flexible, not, I don't want to say weaken or lessen, but make labor regulations not as strict, because that will help to enhance Brazilian firms' competitiveness. And I mean, there was an article in the FT that we cite actually in the paper with Rita, a previous paper, really showing that even the Brazilian government, right, sees these regulations as potentially hampering Brazilian firms' competitiveness. It's a difficult trade-off that we face, because sure, we think women should have maternity benefits. We think there should be labor market protections more generally for workers. At the same time, from the firm's perspective, we recognize that these protections and particularly some of the very strict firing costs in the Brazilian economy, again, might hamper, might lessen, certainly influence labor turnover, and because it makes workers, formal workers, more costly for the firms in Brazil to employ if they have to also face an additional cost per worker for all of the mandated benefits. So I'm not sure if that's what you were getting at. Yes.
No, that's exactly what I was trying to get at.
Labor market regulations in this context are going to probably weaken a firm's competitiveness. At the same time, we recognize that there is also a very clear skill differential between formal and informal workers. Now, it's not 100%, of course. It doesn't mean that all formal workers are skilled and all informal workers are unskilled. But from the firm's perspective, even if you think you're going to want to, skirt some of the labor regulations and just hire an informal worker, that informal worker may not always be as productive as the formal worker you could have hired by paying them. That said, previous work that Rita and I did on the formal economy showed quite clearly that overall firm productivity was weakened. So if you think of a trade shock in a heterogeneous firm context, would tend to increase firm level productivity, following some of Nina's work. That increase in productivity through the gains from trade was certainly mitigated, was weakened for firms facing strict labor market regulations. So if competitiveness there also means productivity, yes, the labor market regulations are inhibiting productivity, inhibiting firms' competitiveness if they're too strict. Where we stop, I don't know that our work can answer any of that. We're not saying go to zero. I don't think that would fly for many, but being flexible or more flexible can help to, which is what I tried to sort of hint at in this concluding slide here, may in fact tend to protect workers more than these than the labor policies themselves, by allowing firms to be flexible and adjust.
Hi, I have a question. So I was wondering, hi, about the timing of the enforcement, similar to what you did with manufacturing and non-manufacturing. I would think also that if I saw that inspectors came to inspect someone in my industry last year, they're probably going to maybe focus on a different industry this year. So I was wondering if you had considered looking at lags of enforcement and whether that would have an effect. And then I had another question, and I apologize, my internet went in and out, so I apologize if I missed it, but I wasn't clear on what the penalty was when you do get an infraction and how likely that is to affect their, what they do.
Yeah. Good question. In other work, we've used lags. We've also used sort of what you might call the predetermined or the pre-reform sort of cross-sectional distribution of enforcement to think about the impact of enforcement. I don't know that we have done it in this paper yet, so it's certainly worth exploring those. Certainly the lagged enforcement, but not just lags. I like your idea of it being, look, sort of as like our manufacturing versus non-manufacturing, not just that lagged enforcement is even, more exogenous than, that's basically the way we were looking at it before, was that even if you worry that enforcement is still endogenous, lagged enforcement is less endogenous than today's enforcement. So, but I think it's interesting to think about, whether you're inspected are you more flexible because you know that you were, your industry or your city was inspected last year, and you think you can get away with something. That's something that we could certainly explore given the data.
I'll send you a paper. There are some papers that look at like the probability of you getting inspected when it comes to environmental, like, enforcement of emission regulation. So I'll send that to you. It might be helpful.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. I had another thought on your question, but it has slipped my mind.
I asked about the penalties.
Oh, the penalties, the fines, yes. So we also have data on fines, and not just whether you were inspected, but whether you were fined. That, on the one hand, we think is probably even more endogenous than actually being inspected. But I know we've looked at that. I don't know if I have anything interesting to tell you right now, but what are the fines? The fines can be, a percentage of the, workforce. So, I mean, it's not insignificant. I think I wrote some of it here, on what exactly a fine might be, but, it's not an insignificant, sort of real or dollar amount for each firm. So it's something that we think will actually, generate behavior or changes in behavior if you're fined.
I think Matthew Templeton also had a question. You looked set to go. Is that correct? Go ahead.
Yeah, I didn't want to jump in. Can you hear me okay?
Sure.
Yeah. This is a more basic question of how we perceive the kind of dynamics and the basic cause really of informality. So I've got a model in my head which is more of seeing informality as a kind of peripheral economy of kind of street hawkers and things like that, who emerge in a situation in which the core economy of kind of more formal, higher productivity activities is essentially failing to demand enough employment. So there's a kind of lack of demand in that core economy. But so I want to check.
Sorry, I am struggling to hear you. I thought you were fine at first. You're saying the informal economy is sort of peripheral and the formal economy is at the core.
Yeah, and so the model of what is, and to an extent that the size of the peripheral economy, in fact its existence, is determined by a kind of insufficiency in the core to generate enough jobs. But I'm seeing that as that is essentially a separate sector in a way. As I say, kind of things like street hawkers, people trying to scrapple out a living outside of the standard sector of higher productivity, large firms. So that's what kind of my working model of informality. But I think what you're looking at is firms that may be quite high productivity, which are producing on a quite large scale tradable products, goods and services, and that they've got an internal decision as to whether to hire people on a formal or informal basis. So I just want to check that, and obviously the way I'm characterizing it does suggest that there could be other things at work in terms of essentially aggregate demand in the economy.
Mm-hmm. That would be, I mean, the aggregate demand issue I'm not so concerned about, because that would be captured in our sort of broad scale sector specific even, or time specific effects. But I do see your point, and I think that it's not uncommon to have those two views of what is an informal worker, right? Are you somebody, the street hawkers are not going to be in our data, right? We're really thinking about manufacturing, this, sort of service economy of, domestic work in the household of informality, not going to be in our data. So yes, there's the possibility for, even formal firms to be hiring workers informally, right? Making that decision that, okay, even if you want to think about it as, today you're my contract worker, I'm not actually employing you, but I'm going to hire you, bring you on to do a couple of these odd tasks around the firm today. But yes, there's a possibility for there to be entirely informal firms, if you will. Those are I think what you have in mind, that's a completely different sector, right? Of people who are just informal, the self-employed guy who's out on the street, driving his rickshaw or selling his handicraft. What we have in mind is a little bit more I don't know, it's possible for a very formal firm. They tend to be smaller, right? We're not talking about, large exporters are probably going to also be regulated by international markets and regulated by international institutions, and so may have fewer of them. But yes, in our mind, in our framework, it is possible for you to be a firm with some workers informal and some formal, if that's answering your question.
Yeah, completely. But then it then, because my thinking was the other one, it then raises a question which I haven't thought about, which is then what would the mechanism be for an improvement in the trade balance? Essentially, I think is our thinking here. But we could just say an improvement in the buoyancy of the sector that a firm like that is in. What would the transmission be from that increase in buoyancy to then them wanting to be more formal with their employment contracts? And I guess this may be what
so in my mind, the transmission mechanism is that relative price change from the real exchange rate shock. So the simple fact that if I'm a Brazilian producer, my goods having depreciate, when the real depreciates, my goods are now cheaper on foreign markets, which allows me to expand production and expand employment. So to me, that's the mechanism I have in my mind. Or by contrast, that single exchange rate shock, that single depreciation weakens import competition because the price of the price of foreign goods in the Brazilian market is now relatively more expensive. So to me, that's the mechanism at least I have in my mind, that would allow firms to take in fact, because we're looking at industry specific real exchange rate shocks, take their the relative price change of their good in the markets they most frequently trade with, and that feeds through both sort of output or sales and into employment.
But so would a simple increase of their employment in here map to or be kind of equivalent to an increase in formality? So say they've got 100 employees, 50 of them are informal, 50 of them are formal. If they just double both of those, does that constitute an increase in formality?
I see what you're saying. In the industry, at the industry level, it may, right? Because this is all at the industry level ultimately. So some firms shifting may in fact, but I see your point. And you're basically asking me about what happens, not sort of the last question I rushed through really quickly. All right, our main dependent variable is the share of informality. But maybe we should be looking at overall total informal employment and overall formal employment, because if all we're doing is seeing a decrease in informality, or that's the argument that trade decreases the share of informality, but it's a decrease in informality, but maybe it's also a decrease and maybe even an even larger decrease in formal employment. That's not good for anybody either. So this certainly shouldn't be thought of in that way. And I don't know, Lorenzo, if you want to chime in here and remind me exactly what the results from those level effects told us. I don't recall that it was that was the case, but maybe Lorenzo, if you are there, you want to chime in. If not, I will just tell you that that's something that we are definitely thinking about and working on, and we've got results to incorporate.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, thank you. It's interesting.
Thank you. The other thing with response to your sort of first question about, the sort of two distinct categories, I think of your mindset of informality as the sort of self-employed workers. And, you kind of do odd jobs here and there, but you still have your own, worker card. And we definitely did do all of these estimations where we think of them as informal as well. We had dropped them out to begin with. We didn't initially think of them as informal workers in the Brazilian case. But we did the estimations again with those workers, and again, qualitatively, they were consistent. So it doesn't seem to be that there's something different going on for the self-employed workers as for the, what I think of as more true informal, that is workers working in the formal economy without a formal work authorization.
Wonderful, Jennifer. I'm afraid we're 10 minutes over. Unless someone has a really burning question, I would suggest perhaps we move it offline. So thank you so much, and my apologies for my audio issues.
Thank you to everyone for showing up, and I welcome you to email me. It's just my last name, poole@american.edu, and I would love to welcome your thoughts on our ways forward and yes, next steps. So thanks for showing up and helping us at the very least to get a set of slides on paper so I can begin thinking about our end of the month. This is a really good commitment device to be in a comfortable and relatively low cost setting to talk to colleagues. So thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jennifer. Thank you. Bye.